right, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending our education book discussion with David Bernstein. I'm Jenna Robinson, president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. The Martin Center is a nonprofit organization dedicated to higher education reform. We advocate responsible governance, viewpoint diversity, academic quality, cost-effective education solutions, and innovative market-based reform. You can find more at jamesgmartin.center. The Martin Center's education book discussions are quarterly online events with authors of recent or sort of recent books about higher education or related topics. Thank you to our viewers and donors for making events like this possible. Although this event is free, we appreciate those of you who have made voluntary contributions. Your support fuels everything we do. Before we get started with today's talk, I want to tell you about another upcoming event. This one is in person in Raleigh, North Carolina. On June 15th, we are hosting a luncheon with Dr. Stanley Goldfarb of Do No Harm Medicine. Dr. Goldfarb will talk about restoring merit to higher education. And if you want to find out more about that event, you can go to jamesgmartin.center. I'll hand the floor over to David shortly, but I want to take 1 minute to tell you how this event will run. First, David will talk for about 20 minutes about his book. Then David and I will have a short discussion, and around 3:15, I'll start posing questions from the audience. Viewers, you can post a question using the Q&A icon at any time, which is at the bottom of your screen. I'll pose the questions to David at the end of the discussion. And viewers on Facebook, if you post your questions in the comments section, we'll be sure to monitor those, and I will ask those as well. Also, we are recording this event, so you can watch it later or share it online. With that, I'd like to tell you about our guest today. David Bernstein holds a university professorship chair at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, where he has been teaching since 1995. He has also been a visiting professor at the University of Michigan, Georgetown University, William & Mary, Brooklyn Law School, and the University of Turin. Bernstein often challenges the conventional wisdom with prodigious research and sharp original analysis. His book, Rehabilitating Lochner, was praised across the political spectrum as intellectual history in its highest form. Of his most recent work, Classified, The Untold Story of Racial Classification in America, columnist George F. Will said, "The nation urgently needs what David E. Bernstein here provides, a lucid explanation of the long and tangled intersection of racial classifications and the law. With the intellectual boldness and clarity that he brought to Rehabilitating Lochner, he points to a path from today's tensions to a less angry, more sophisticated future." And of course, that is the book we'll be talking about today. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, David.
Thanks so much for having me. So I wanted to try to focus today on the aspect of my book, Classified, which relates to the Martin Center's agenda, which is about education. And of course, I'm sure most of those of you who are watching this are aware there are two cases before the Supreme Court right now challenging the use of affirmative action preferences in higher education. One of them is against the University of North Carolina, and one of them is against Harvard University. Even though Harvard is private and the University of North Carolina is public, the legal standard is the same because the Supreme Court has long held that the standard for racial discrimination under the 1964 Civil Rights Act is exactly the same as the standard under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. So whatever University of North Carolina is bound by as a public university under the 14th Amendment, Harvard's also bound by under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Now, as you also may be aware, the operative legal standard so far for affirmative action in higher education is that affirmative action preferences are not permitted to have racial balancing. They're not permitted to make up for societal discrimination. They're not permitted to make up for historical discrimination. They're only allowed for the purpose of diversity. So the origin of the obsession that universities have with diversity and with now it's morphed into DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, really originates from this Bakke opinion in 1978. The original motivation of affirmative action was really to bring minorities, particularly African Americans, into the economic mainstream and make up for past and current discrimination, but that's not lawful. So the only thing they could focus on, legally speaking, is diversity. And for the last 50 or so years, when the courts have been hearing cases like this, they've pretty much accepted the classifications used by the university for diversity purposes at face value. So you have Black, Hispanic/Latino, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander, and white. And those are the classifications you use. And it does lead to this very important question, which is, well, why are those the only classifications you have? Why is it that if a university is taking, for example, University of Texas, which was sued in a separate litigation about 15 years ago, why is it that University of Texas could say, well, we have a lot of Asian Americans already, but not enough Latinos. And then someone comes and says, well, look, I am a Hmong American from Minnesota. And as far as I could tell, you have 0 Hmong Americans in the University of Texas, but you already have 2,000 Mexican Americans at your school. So I would actually add more diversity. And the University of Texas says, no, you're just Asian, and we need more Hispanics. And what sense does that make from a diversity point of view? So interestingly enough, in the Supreme Court's oral arguments back in October, when the lawyers came before the court to argue the case, for really the first time, the court emphasized some of these issues when they were questioning the lawyers. In the past, like I said, they just sort of accepted them at face value. So one time, Justice Kavanaugh said, well, how do you guys in the University of North Carolina classify Americans from the Middle East, Arab Americans, and so forth? And I think the point he was going to get at is one of the weird things about the way universities use diversity is they give you automatic diversity credit if you are, say, a white Hispanic from Spain or from Argentina, but you could be a dark-skinned Yemeni Muslim who was, let's say, a refugee and so forth, and face a lot of discrimination, and you look a lot more different from your fellow classmates on average than the Spaniard does, Spanish American does, and the court, and you don't get diversity points because officially Arab Americans are white. And the lawyer for UNC responded by saying, I have no idea how we classify Middle Eastern Americans. I don't know if he really didn't know, which was kind of negligent because it's not hard to figure out because everyone uses the Common App. And the Common App specifically says, are you white? And if it says, are you white, are you European or Middle Eastern background? Or if he did know the answer and didn't want to have to answer the leading question of like, well, why are you considering certain people diverse and not others? Either way, it was interesting that Justice Kavanaugh brought it out. Similarly, Justice Alito asked Harvard's lawyer, he said, look, let's say I'm from Afghanistan and I apply to Harvard. Now, Harvard, unlike UNC, is accused by the plaintiffs not only of illegally using race in admissions in general, but specifically of downgrading Asian American applicants because they don't want to have too many Asians because that would interfere with diversity. So Alito says, let's say I'm from Afghanistan and I apply to Harvard and I say, I'm going to add some diversity to Harvard. Would you consider that? And Harvard says, well, the problem is you're Asian and we already have a lot of Asians. And the Afghan would say, but what do I have to do with someone from China? Asia is a very large area. It extends all the way to the Philippines. To say we're all the same doesn't really make any sense. Now, Harvard's answer is, we consider that too, but the fact is they really don't. I mean, they may consider it, it's kind of a little bit interesting, but they only keep track of how many Hispanics, Asian Americans, whites, Blacks, and so forth they have. They don't look at subcategories. They don't look at religion. They don't look at ideology. They only look at these classifications. And Justice Kavanaugh also asked, well, what if we went away from a racial classification at Harvard and say, well, we're going to let people who are descendants of American slaves get a preference, but not just because you're Black. So if you're an African or Caribbean immigrant, first or second generation, you don't get a preference. But if you're a descendant of American slaves, that might be a political, non-racial classification. So there are a couple more questions along these lines asking about the reasonableness of the classifications themselves, which, like I said, was novel. So that raises the question more broadly, well, where did these classifications come from? No university, to my knowledge, has ever sat down and written a report saying, well, we want diversity. Here's why we chose to prefer Hispanics and why and African Americans and Native Americans, but not Asian Americans, or in the old days, in some cases, they would prefer Asian Americans, why these groups, not others, why Spanish Americans, but not Arab Americans, and so forth. And the obvious answer is they're just taking the classifications that the US government uses for all sorts of statistical purposes, and they just superimpose them on affirmative action. So that goes back, so that leads us to the question which prompted my book, which is, well, where did these classifications come from? How are they defined, and how are they enforced if there's any question? So the short story is that in the early 1970s, the federal government, in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, found it was getting all sorts of data for civil rights enforcement, for in employment, in education, in housing, in banking. Plus, they were just trying to keep track of the progress of various minority groups in various areas. But here was the problem: there were no official federal racial classifications. So for African American, this may not have been that much of an issue because, given the history of the one drop rule, if you kind of looked like you had African descent, you were considered Black. If you didn't, and you look Caucasian, you were considered white. But especially for, say, Hispanics, what we now call Hispanics, we didn't have a word Hispanic back in 1972. No one called people that. They referred to Hispanic literature, but not to people. So you had some agencies that were looking at the largest Hispanic group, Mexican Americans, which had historically faced a fair amount of discrimination, at least if they were of mixed race in the Southwest. You had some agencies that were looking at Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, who also were often of mixed race. Some added Cubans, some added others, some used Spanish language household, some used Spanish surname, some used Latino. There were, I think I counted up on 13 different possible ways of defining this group of people who have Spanish-speaking origins. And that meant that the government was getting different data based on different criteria of who counts from different agencies, and they were comparing apples and oranges. So Caspar Weinberger, who was the head of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare at the time, later became Defense Secretary under Reagan, said, okay, let's create a commission to figure out how we should define these classifications and who should be in them. And at the same time, Richard Nixon was very intent on creating like a Hispanic style classification for two reasons. First, he felt that there was a lot of Chicano, Mexican-American radicalism that he found distasteful and politically inconvenient. And there was also a lot of Puerto Rican radicalism. We tend to forget there used to be plane hijackings, bombings, and whatnot from Puerto Rican nationalists. And he felt that we could create a pan-American, pan-national identity for Spanish speakers that might dim these nationalist kind of sentiments. And he also told some of his aides, wait a second, we're starting some affirmative action programs now. We're giving affirmative action to Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, but not to Cubans, but Cubans vote for us. So we have to include Cubans. So with that background in mind, when the interagency commission got together, they said, okay, we're going to create this pan-national group. We basically asked for one volunteer who was from Cuban American, Puerto Rican American, Mexican American, put them in a room together, come up with something. They came up with Hispanic, kind of arbitrarily, because one of the three was very insistent on Hispanic. So what is Hispanic defined as? Someone who has Spanish origin or culture. Why is this important? Because it excludes Brazilians who are Portuguese, even though they may be Latinos. And it also includes people from Spain who are European. It's not really clear why they should be a minority, but no other Europeans, but they are included. It includes Italian origin, Argentines, and so forth. It is quite contrary to the Chicano ideology, which is that Spanish were the oppressors of the native peoples, and we want to move away from Spain. So that's like one example. African American is defined as being descended from one of the black races of Africa. The one drop rule is basically put into effect. Whites are defined as being of European, Middle Eastern, North African origin. Asians are defined by geography. We include anyone from India to the Philippines as Asian. Originally, Pacific Islanders were part of the group, but they broke off eventually because they said they were facing discrimination in university admissions because they were put in the Asian class. Originally, the Asian classification wasn't meant to include South Asians because they're Caucasian and they were being pretty successful in overall in education and business. The Indian immigrants, that is, and an Indian American group lobbied at the last minute and said, we saw the proposal. We don't think we should be considered white. We could face a lot of discrimination based on the fact that we're darker skinned. We want to be in the Asian classification. So we have this bizarre Asian classification that goes all the way from India to the Philippines, including people who have nothing in common genetically, culturally, anthropologically, anything else. And it's really bizarre to use that for diversity purposes. And then you might say, well, Asians, everyone knows they're a successful minority group, but that's also not really true. If it turns out, if you want to parse the statistics, it turns out if you look at places like Harvard or Berkeley or other schools, the Asian students are predominantly Indian American and Chinese American, with a smaller concentration of Japanese American, Korean American. Those groups all do significantly better than the average educationally, economically, and so forth. But you get to Bangladeshis, Malaysians, Vietnamese, Cambodians. They are average or below average socioeconomically. Filipinos have gone from being one of the poorest ethnic groups in the U.S. to one of the wealthier ones, but education is not the forte of that particular subgroup, so you don't find a big overrepresentation of Filipinos. So to say, oh, well, you're all Asians is kind of reductionist and silly. So let's go then back one more step and say, wait, well, why are we focusing on racial diversity to begin with, as opposed to other kinds of diversity? And why are these the only classifications that we have? So the classifications themselves go back to the 1950s, when President Eisenhower signed some executive orders banning discrimination by government contractors. And they had to sign a pledge that we don't discriminate, but then eventually they said, well, we don't trust you. Tell us how many employees you have of these different groups so we could see whether you're really excluding people. And it wasn't clear. There were different versions. Some included Jews, some included Catholics. Eventually, for two major reasons, they settled on focusing on so-called visible minorities, Mexican Americans, Black Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, and Native Americans. And the two reasons were, first of all, the NAACP and other African-American oriented groups said, race is the major issue in this country. Ideologically, we don't think white people should be the focus. But there was another reason, which was, at the time, it was considered at best rude and at worst illegal in some states to ask people what ethnicity, religion, race, etc. are you. So if you're an HR officer at a big defense contractor in 1958 and you have to tell the government how many people you have who are minorities, you really just have to look around and say, hey, this guy looks Black, this guy looks Mexican, this lady looks Chinese, and you could write that down, but you can't really tell necessarily who's Polish or Italian or Jewish or Catholic. So for both those reasons, race wound up being the focus. And then by the 1970s, we shift from non-self-identification, identification by others, to self-identification. And once so in the old days, the only Hispanics who have been counted are people who are obviously in some way Hispanic. But once you get to self-identification, then you could be an entirely European descended person who looks, like me, let's say, and write down Hispanic because you have Hispanic, and Spanish-speaking ancestry, and that was fine. So by sort of happenstance, this racial category based on being visible turned into broader ethnic and racial classifications. Now, I should add, by the way, very interestingly, in the educational context, the Supreme Court has traditionally talked about Hispanic as being a racial classification, racial preferences. In fact, Hispanic is an ethnic category because obviously Hispanics could be of any race. And but Justice Sotomayor, for example, wrote a whole thing about how race matters. And you talk about Hispanics. Hispanics are not legally a race. However, in 1977, when these classifications were put into federal law, universities and other entities were given two choices. You could either ask about ethnicity first, Hispanic or not, and then ask about race, or ask about them all together. Then you have to check Hispanic or a different race. So universities almost all went with the second option and put Hispanic together with Black, white, Asian, and so forth, and thus treated it like a racial classification. In 1997, the rules were changed, and you now were required to first ask about about ethnicity, then race, but the Department of Education didn't change its rules for another 11 years. So for a good 30 years, universities got used to treating Hispanic as if it were a racial category. That's what the Supreme Court got used to too. But it's one of the anomalies and oddities of the system that during oral arguments, everyone's talking about racial diversity, but in fact, it's not racial diversity. It's racial and ethnic diversity, and Hispanic is an ethnicity. And no one's really ever explained why, out of all the ethnicities in the United States, ranging from Icelanders to Poles and Irish and Jews and Turks and Armenians, why it's only Hispanic ethnicity that gets a preference if it's not a racial minority. So that's more or less where things stand now. As far as how we have these sort of arbitrary classifications that were not explicitly not meant to do anything but create statistical uniformity, that became adopted very quickly for affirmative action purposes, that are inherently arbitrary, contradictory, and allow for situations where someone who's the great grandson of Spanish conquistadors, comes from an extremely wealthy Mexican family, gets the exact same preference as the child of farm workers from California who are indigenous in origin, and again, we treat people from India the same as people from the Philippines and so forth. All these sort of arbitrary things, and once we start looking at classifications and how sort of silly they are, the whole thing sort of starts to unravel. If the goal is really to achieve diversity, well, again, why is having X number, we already have 500 Mexican Americans, why is having one more diverse than getting your first Armenian or whatever? If we're looking at maybe the more true underlying base of affirmative action, originally trying to bring African Americans into the economic mainstream, in education, and especially outside of education, like in business enterprises, the majority of people who are benefiting from these preferences aren't African American, and those who are African American who are benefiting are wildly disproportionately the children of first and second generation, or sorry, not the children. They are either the first or second generation African and Jamaican and other Caribbean immigrants. So at Harvard, for example, it's somewhere like 60 to 80% in any given year of the Black students are actually either immigrants or second generation immigrants, or have one white parent. So these are not the sort of historically underprivileged people because of state policy and private discrimination that we normally think of. So it'll be interesting. I mean, everyone, including me, expects the Supreme Court to rule Harvard and UNC's policies to be illegal, unconstitutional. It'll be very interesting to me, of course, personally, to see whether they focus at all on the classification issue and how arbitrary they are. And regardless, it'll be interesting to see that once the current system falls, assuming it does, whether that leads to some sort of reconsideration of how we classify people and why. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So now I'll ask you a few questions, and then, like I said, at around maybe 3:10, 3:15, we'll open it up to the audience. So to start with, tell me how you got the idea to write, a book about this topic. How did you first decide that classified would make a good book?
I originally started because I had come across some cases where it turns out that states had different ways of classifying different groups. Like some states included Portuguese in the Hispanic category, or separately had a separate Portuguese category, like in Massachusetts, they're an affirmative action category. I sort of decided to write an article which eventually was published in the USC Law Review, so the California Law Review, as the Modern American Law of Race, where the original goal was primarily to look at how different jurisdictions define the different racial classifications. As I was doing this, I came across the fact that there aren't as many differences as I expected, because it turns out there is this one big federal regulation in 1977 which dominates the field, which all federal agencies basically abide by, with a couple of minor exceptions, and which basically have dictated the at least broad outlines of what states do, even if they sometimes differ in minor specifics. So I discovered this federal law, and I looked into it, and I said, did a search on Westlaw, which is the legal database. Only 30 law professors, despite the thousands of articles written about race in the United States and law reviews, only 30 law professors have ever even cited this regulation. And no one I talked to has ever heard of it. I had never heard of it, even though I've been a law professor for 25 years. And this has obviously had a huge impact on American society. It's a law that almost no one knows about, and it answers a lot of questions like, why is it that Italians or Jews or whoever are not considered minorities? Why are people from Spain? All these things that you might have thought about in your life. Why isn't there a racial category? One thing that helped spur me to think this book would be interesting was I had a nanny from Peru, and I'm with her applying for a green card, and she checks off she's Hispanic, and she says to me, what should I put down for race? It's all in Spanish. And I say, well, are you white? You consider yourself white? No, she said, I'm not white. I said, but you're not black. She says, no, not black. I'm mestiza. Mixed race, what in Latin America they call mixed race, indigenous and white, but we don't have a classification like that. It would be logical to put them in sort of the Native American category as indigenous, but American Indians have been very strongly against adding millions of Latin American immigrants into that category because they have to share Bureau of Indian Affairs resources with them. So they left with like really no race. And some of them consider themselves white and put down white, others just check other. But it's just like one of those things like, this is really interesting. And no one really thinks about it. We all sort of just accept these classifications as a given, but they're obviously, if you think about them, really arbitrary.
All right. So I didn't earlier, but I'm going to share everybody a copy of the book. This is the book we're talking about, Classified, the Untold Story of Racial Classification in America. And it's a great book, but we'll continue our conversation. So the next question I have is, could you give us some examples of how racial classifications harm the public interest? I think your example about someone from Peru not knowing what to do is a great illustration of how it can harm an individual, but how does it harm the public interest?
Well, obviously reasonable people may disagree about this, but I think a really harmful aspect of racial classifications, it forces all of us to put ourselves into a particular box and to do it kind of frequently. And there are a lot of people out there, including myself, who we don't go around thinking of ourselves as white people. I mean, I have a lot of different identities. I'm a law professor. I'm Jewish. I'm from New York. I now live in Virginia. I'm a dad. I'm a husband. But I never have to check those really for anything. I'm constantly checking that I'm white. And that, I think, makes people more conscious of their race. Now, there is a group of people on the left. When I was doing research for my book, I several times came across this phrase white racial consciousness, which I would have associated previously with like David Duke. But it turns out this is a big trendy thing to be in favor of on the left. And the idea is that if we encourage white people to see themselves as white, as that being their primary identity, they will then recognize their white privilege and then use that recognition to become anti-racist activists. Now, I'm not saying this would never happen. Obviously, the people who push this are often people who have had this epiphany. But the idea, based on human history and psychology, that I'm going to just declare myself to be part of Group X, and my reaction to being part of Group X will be to help Group Y at the expense of Group X, is not what we usually see. That was my initial reaction. And then I looked up the social science literature, and not at all to my surprise, the more Americans think of themselves as having a white identity, the more likely they are to be racist. So I think at the grassroots level, Americans are increasingly tolerant, interdating, intermarrying, intermingling in all sorts of ways. The rate of approval of interracial marriage has gone from 4% in 1958 to 95% today, and higher among young people. But there is this danger that the more we put people in these racial boxes and then say, and we're going to distribute benefits based on them, whether it be affirmative action or medical care or all sorts of other things people are talking about, the more we're going to encourage the zero-sum game where different groups are fighting with each other politically. And that never has a good outcome around the world.
I didn't warn you of this question ahead of time, but it just popped into my head, and I apologize. But one of the things that are used on university campuses these days and in business as well is affinity groups. And this is, of course, an extension of classification, that we have these affinity groups on campus. Can you talk a little bit about particularly how that might be a harmful thing?
So I am of two minds of affinity groups. to the extent that people voluntarily want to associate with members of an ethnic group or religious group or even a racial group where they find they have cultural or other things in common, and so forth, to some extent, those are the little platoons that Tocqueville and whatnot talked about that separate us from the government, right? We have affinity. We have all sorts of different affinity associations. They could also be based, of course, in common interests, where we like nerdy Dungeons and Dragons kinds of games or whatever. But the danger is, like, I think, institutionalizing them, having the when universities say, we'll support your affinity, but not if you're this or that, the other thing, but we want you to think of yourself as a Latino or as an Asian and so forth, and sort of make people feel almost inadequate if, like, someone says, well, I'm a Korean American, but I like that heritage, but I also just think of myself as really being American. And then they're sort of, in some cases, you read sort of bullied, like, no, you have to join the Asian American group and be part of that. That's I think that's that's sort of unproductive, and is, again, while I'm not against people forming affinity groups voluntarily, when it comes from the authority figures and trying to push it on people, I think it, in that sense, is divisive.
Right. So your book makes it clear that the country has suffered from the unforeseen consequences of classifications. Do you think there were initially any sound reasons for a policy of classifying citizens?
Sure. Look, like I said, I mean, back when they were doing the classification scheme, they were trying to figure out how to enforce civil rights laws and so forth and keep track of discrimination. Now, one could argue, and I've had, like, Glenn Lurie, I was on a podcast with him where he argued, we have to classify people to enforce these laws. Maybe it's better not to have them. But the fact is, I mean, the American people, either then or now, are prepared to say, well, we won't enforce, or we'll only enforce very marginally the Voting Rights Act or fair housing laws and whatnot. And it's really difficult to figure out how you enforce some of these laws unless you're able to keep track of which groups are, like, how you enforce the Voting Rights Act lets you know whether blacks are voting in Alabama or whatever. So in that sense, not only was it not poorly intentioned, but the classifications themselves aren't terrible. They're not great. I mean, there's no reason still to put Asian Indians and Chinese people in the same classification, but they're not terrible in the sense that, okay, even, if people don't like Mexican Americans, they probably don't also like Puerto Rican Americans. They probably also don't like Cuban Americans, because there tends to be a similar discrimination. If they don't like born Black Americans, they probably also don't like Black immigrants. So there's something to be said for aggregating those statistics. But again, no one ever sat around or took the effort to say, okay, we have these for that purpose, but now we have other purposes. Now we want to try to help groups that have been historically excluded from the economy, or now we want to make sure that our medical research is an area that drives me nuts. That we're using these arbitrary, scientifically bizarre classifications in medical research. We're looking to ensure that medical research is sufficiently inclusive. What would make sense for those purposes? Or if we're using race for diversity or ethnicity for diversity, what does diversity mean? Instead, just these classifications were just naively and crudely superimposed upon policies where no one had ever bothered to think about them. And, back in 1978, the country was still overwhelmingly white and Black, and even Hispanics were generally still considered to be overall white group. But since then, we've had this massive immigration of tens of millions of Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans and Black people from Africa and the Caribbean. And we've had much higher rates of intermarriage. So the groups are, the distinctions are much harder to draw. And the classification scheme hasn't changed at all.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to put on my social science hat for a minute. And obviously in social science, these classifications are used all the time in doing data analysis. We find out if there are disparities in learning outcomes or health outcomes or any other kinds of outcomes. Do you think the kind of arbitrary and outdated way that we classify people, does that mean that we can't trust our social science research?
It means that the social science research, is sometimes garbage in, garbage out, to be honest. And look, I don't blame the researchers. If you're trying to get tenure somewhere or try to finish your PhD thesis and you need data, you could create your own data set, but that would take immense amount of money and effort, or you could just use the Census Bureau, which collects, does this American community survey and uses basically the same classifications that we're talking about, and just use that. I'm not sure why pollsters don't dig more deeper, and they also use these. They could do that since they're calling people anyway. But in any event, just let me give you an example. I imagine that when Governor DeSantis gets his presidential campaigning gear, there's going to be either positive or negative talk, or maybe both, about how Hispanics are doing educationally in Florida. But what does that really mean? Hispanics in Florida are divided among a very large Cuban American population, which itself came in two big waves. One when Castro first came into power, the other the Mario boat lift in 1980. Then you have a large Puerto Rican population that has come to Florida over the last decade or two after bad hurricanes there. You have Mexican American farm worker population in the middle of the state. You have a lot of South American people fleeing socialism in places like Venezuela, and they are divided between the more upper class people who bought property and came here on visas, and a lot of other people who are here either with marginal or no legal status. So you aggregate them all together and say, oh, Hispanics are doing X or Y. Well, what does that mean? These are all very different groups, and if all of a sudden one group became larger, that could affect the statistics for the group as a whole, but it doesn't necessarily mean that any of the subgroups are doing better or worse.
No, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned earlier that Native Americans or indigenous people, there was a feeling that they shouldn't expand that category to South American indigenous people. Is that pretty standard that there are interest groups around these identities or classifications that are kind of gaming the system to keep things the way they are or change things? And this is used for something in a way that pushes the interests of some groups against others.
Sure. So I already mentioned the example of we have the indigenous Latin American example. We have the example of Indian Americans lobbying to be part of the Asian category where they're originally scheduled to be part of the white classification. We have Native Hawaiians were complaining that they didn't want to be part of this AAPI group back in the 90s because they faced discrimination as like Asians when they were applying to colleges in California. So they asked to be in the Native American and Alaska Native classification. They're sort of like Alaska Natives analogously, but again, those groups said, no, we don't want the Native Hawaiians in there. So they instead made a new classification with them along with Pacific Islanders, although Filipinos, who are literally Pacific Islanders and who are ethnographically, anthropologically, genetically closer to Samoans and Tongans and Hawaiians than to East Asians, were still left as Asians. In the 1990s, there was a big movement to have a multiracial category, which all the traditional civil rights groups opposed because they felt it would take away constituents. Some mixed race Black people or Asian people or whatnot, mixed race. So who's to say that what they're really, that they're Black and not like half, whatever. That's how they saw it. If they say we're not Asian, we're multiracial, or not Black, we're multiracial, they would lose constituents. So eventually, the compromise that was reached was that it used to be you could only check one box. Now you could check more than one racial box. You could say you're white and Black or whatever. But the rub was once no one was paying any attention anymore, most federal agencies created new rules that said that if you check off white and any other classification, we put you down as the minority classification. If you check Black in any other classification, we put you down as Black. So if you check white and Black, you're Black. If you check white and Asian, you're white, you're Asian. If you check Asian and Black, you're Black. So so once no one was paying attention, they basically went back to the one drop rule regardless. So there's that. There's the fact there is a move now to make Hispanic a racial category, which really doesn't make any sense except politically. But one reason that it has not been a racial classification is that Asian American groups were, especially back when there were fewer Asians in the country, were afraid that Filipinos, if given a choice between Hispanic as a race and Asian as a race, that many of them who have Spanish descent would put down Hispanic, and that would cost the Asian groups some of their constituents. And one could go on and on with different examples, but you get, this is not some prestige. It's not, we haven't had like expert sociologists, anthropologists, geneticists, sociologists get together to try to make sense of this. This has just happened through through lobbying, through incompetence, and so forth.
Yeah. All of this is it's ultimately making me just not trust the data at all. That's the upshot of this. And you already talked a lot about the Supreme Court. Yeah, ultimately, the Supreme Court can end racial preferences. They can kind of go in between. They can narrowly tailor their decision. Do you want to make a prediction about how they're going to do that, and then about how universities will respond to the decision?
So I think that if this were 10 years ago, the court might very well issue an opinion along the lines of, look, we keep telling you guys that you have to do what we call in law narrow tailoring, that you have to consider all the other alternatives before you use race. You at UNC and Harvard haven't done so, probably no one else has done so. So you have to go back and do that. And that would allow universities to come back and try to, try to use race the more narrowly tailored way and still get by the courts. I don't think that's going to happen for a couple of reasons. First, the court is just simply more conservative than it had been. But I think also two other factors are the court has, in the Fisher case involving the University of Texas a decade ago, said when we say narrow tailoring, we really mean it. That was like the way they were able to get consensus. There was apparently an original vote to overturn affirmative action completely, but they said, okay, instead of doing that, we're just going to say you really have to narrowly tailor. And no one's been doing that. Harvard didn't do it at all until even look at how they were doing things until they got sued. So I think there's this sense that universities have really been cheating, and the court keeps reminding them that they're supposed to use race narrowly. Instead, they've interpreted that as long as we're not officially using quotas, we can do whatever we want. And the third reason, though, which may be the most important, is when you read Justice Powell's decisive opinion in Bakke and you read Justice O'Connor's decisive opinion in the Grutter case in 2003 on affirmative action, they both clearly believed in deferring to the establishment, the university establishment, and other elements of the establishment. I don't think the current Supreme Court is so inclined. There is a hostility between the elite institutions of society and the conservative legal establishment specifically that wasn't necessarily there 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Justice Kavanaugh, for example, was about an establishment, a guy, as you could imagine, having been second President Bush's personal secretary for years, right? This is not a rabble-rousing right-winger. He was teaching at Harvard as an adjunct professor from the DC Circuit when he was nominated to the Supreme Court. He was tied into that elite establishment. After his confirmation hearing and the apparently unfounded allegations of sexual assault, they came to a mutual decision that he was no longer going to be teaching at Harvard. Like, the students would have protested. He would have been treated very poorly. I don't know so neither of them wanted him to come anymore. He teaches at my university now, George Mason Law School, which is like the only right-leaning secular law school in the country, which is great for us. And so far, we're not Harvard though, but the question is, if you're Justice Kavanaugh or you're Justice Roberts, the justices who are the most sort of establishment and moderate, why would you defer to a place like Harvard Law School right now? We know what went on in Stanford lately with a federal judge being disrupted who was conservative. Why would you trust the likes of Stanford University or Yale University, Yale Law School, where there have been also disruptions of conservatives? These people are hostile they're not only hostile to you personally and hostile to your ideology, but they're telling you we believe in diversity, but then they act as if anyone who's right of Barack Obama is an evil fascist who shouldn't be listened to at all. So they don't really believe in diversity, right? Because they don't like ideological diversity. So I just see the court issuing a pretty strict and strong opinion saying you can't use race.
Yeah. And so what do you think universities will do
I think that will vary. It will vary based on how cautious they are legally, how cautious their general counsel is, whether they're state or private. I think a lot of state universities are going to look at what Florida and Texas do, which is to revamp their admissions so that at least some portion of the class is taken from the top X% of any high school in the country. So that way you get more geographic and ultimately ethnic diversity by taking a kid from the inner city high schools in the top 10%, even if their SAT scores aren't that high. And that might be challenged eventually also, but I don't know what the court would do as a proxy for race, but I'm not sure the court would see it that way. Some universities, I think, will just continue to cheat and say, we'll wait till we get sued. Some will actually try to eliminate some of the programs that currently benefit whites, like recruiting people for lacrosse or preferring children of alumni and try to get more diversity that way. And I think the worst outcome, which may be the most common, is that some universities will say, oh, we're not looking for race anymore. We're going to be looking for people who have a commitment to diversity. And the question is, how do you show commitment to diversity? Well, you could be active. You could be active in a pro-diversity group. You could be active in the African American student group, or the Latino student group, and so forth. And it will be worse than race in a way, because it will serve as a proxy for race. But also, you'll have to be woke. So we'll take people who are woke, who will be wildly disproportionately minority, but not all minority, and that will make, in a whole variety of ways, things. At least now, if you are Black or Hispanic or whatever, you are getting this preference regardless of need or your exact background. But at least no one's checking to see whether you prefer Thurgood Marshall or Clarence Thomas. But now this may be a thing. So I know that the people who were responsible for the lawsuit are concerned about these issues, are thinking about them. Whether they have a good solution if they win, I'm not sure.
Thank you. Bill Clinton famously said of the welfare system that we should mend it, not end it. When it comes to our system of classifications, do you think we should mend it or end it?
So I think, in a sense, both. I mean, I think I didn't actually write this in the book, but I was thinking about it later. One thing I should have said in the book is the first thing we should do about racial classifications is that the Supreme Court says that racial classifications are only allowed when they serve a compelling government interest and are narrowly tailored. So the first question we should ask is that when we're using racial classification, do we actually need racial classification to begin with? And for example, in the case of medical research or medical practice, I come to the conclusion in chapter 6 of my book that race is just not a proper dividing line for medical treatment or for medical research, that it doesn't correlate sufficiently well with genetics, and that even if it did, we don't even use like the kind of categories that someone who cared about race does. Hispanic isn't a race, for example. People from India and people from China are not genetically closely, they're not part of it. Well, anyone calls the same race regardless. So it wouldn't make sense to use even real, even quote unquote historic or real race, but we don't even do that. So there's some cases where we shouldn't be using it at all, and it may be counterproductive. When we do use race or other kinds of classifications, we should be thinking, what are we using them for? I mean, France doesn't allow for these classifications at all, but then France has civil rights problems with some of its minority groups because it doesn't know who's being discriminated against or what and in what context. So I don't think we're ready to go that far. But so again, the classifications even that we have are not terrible for that. But if we're trying to, for example, another example I thought of after my book was published was hate crimes, right? We are concerned about hate crimes and we want to know who's being victimized by them, but we don't naively use the Directive 15, 1978 classifications. We also include Jews and Catholics and old people and disabled people and Muslims and Arabs, right? Because all those groups may face hate crimes. So there's no so that's what we should do in general. We should say, well, what are we trying to accomplish here? Do we really need to use race to accomplish it, or any kind of class? It doesn't have to be a racial classification. Do we need to classify people to accomplish it? Maybe sometimes we could just look at socioeconomic status, whatever. But if we do need to classify people, we should figure out what we're trying to achieve and then ask ourselves whether the classifications that we're using get to that. And in some cases, that may be the government, but we should also be more open to letting private organizations, without fear of lawsuit, figure out if we're trying to achieve X, again, how do we need to classify people?
Excellent. Thank you. And the last question from me is, how has your book been received in the legal academy? Have you gotten a lot of blowback? Have you gotten support? Tell me about that.
So, I have to say that of the people who've actually looked at the book, including people on the left, I've gotten nothing but praise. In fact, I have a friend who's sort of a critical race theorist who's very prominent in that area, who read the book and was appearing on a podcast with me. She was really afraid, we're friends. I was afraid to be on the podcast with you because I thought I'd have to argue with you. But I read the book and I kind of agreed with almost everything. Because actually on the left also they're starting to rethink these classifications, because it's dawned on some activists that while Native Americans and Black Americans have faced the most discrimination by the state and by private actors, that that their numbers are being overwhelmed by recent immigrants who are also officially people of color and are getting some of the benefits they think they should be getting. Anyway, so the reactions in that sense have been primarily positive. I haven't gotten invited to give a lot of talks about it. It's more been ignored than anything else. My sense of the matter is that, first of all, I'm not on the left. I'm writing about race, so there's a little skepticism there. But also, I think there's a reluctance by people who support affirmative action to think about classification issues. Not so much because they think that the classifications we use are sensible, but because they understand that ever since affirmative action started in the 1970s, it's been unpopular and under legal threat. And to concede that there's something wrong with our classification system would be potentially giving ammunition to the other side, which in some sense is not wrong. But although I also tell them, I'm not in the context of business enterprise preferences, so many people are able to claim minority business status now that soon, within a generation, with all the intermarriage and immigration, everyone will be able to claim, almost everyone, 80-90% of the population will be eligible. If everyone's eligible, no one's eligible. So if you want to preserve affirmative action, to some extent, you have to worry. But in any event, I think the idea is, let's not address this issue because it's too uncomfortable. If we can't really defend the current system, but if we acknowledge its flaws, then we're giving the other side ammunition. I haven't had any actual hostility from anybody.
That's really good to hear. Thank you. So now I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. And I have one already that was emailed in this morning from a friend of the Martin Center named Tom. Tom asks, he says, in an otherwise excellent book, you advocate racial preferences for American descendants of slavery. How can you rationalize discrimination against two groups of white Americans? One, those whose only connection with slavery is through ancestors who lived more than 150 years ago. And two, those who have no ancestors who owned American slaves because their ancestors were late arrivals and immigrated to the U.S. long after slavery was illegal.
All right, so let me first clarify that I don't actually take a position on whether we should have affirmative action for American descendants of slaves. What I do say two things. I say, first of all, if you wanted to still have affirmative action of some sort without risking, with the possibility of using a non-racial basis for it, the Supreme Court might very well find American descendants of slaves to be a political/historical classification rather than a racial one, therefore subject to lesser scrutiny, therefore possibly constitutional, even if affirmative action in general is not. Racial preferences is not. The second thing I say is that to the extent, and I believe this is true, to the extent the underlying moral, political, pragmatic impetus for affirmative action is to redress the harms, the historic harms with current effects on African Americans that result from the history of slavery and Jim Crow and so forth, this would be a way of satisfying that goal without you having to use a diversity rationale, without having to include all sorts of post-1965 immigrant groups that haven't suffered that. I do think that, I've been talking, I'm not an affirmative action scholar. My book really isn't about affirmative action. It's about classification, but I have been on panels and so forth over the years on affirmative action. And what I always find is no matter how much I emphasize, because I've been interested in this for a long time, that in a lot of contexts, most of the people getting affirmative action are not Black at all. They're Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, people with one great-grandparent who was a Cherokee, whatever. The discussion always comes back to, what about African Americans and their specific history? So, if nothing else, I'm not taking a position on affirmative action for American descendants or slaves or not, but I would say that it would be preferable, much preferable to the current system, to limit affirmative action to that category. Among other things, it gets rid of rent seeking, right? If that's the only category you're allowed, says the Supreme Court, then we don't have to worry about new groups coming up and demanding. Like in India, everyone now gets affirmative action. It started with the untouchables, and now it's like 80% of the population. And the other thing, again, is it doesn't allow the government to then say, racially speaking, if you're of a certain ethnic background. So I think it's preferable to the current system. I'm not sure I would support it. I do think that 95% of the energy on the pro-affirmative action side would go away if it was limited to that, but that was allowed. So that might be a compromise that would reduce the tensions over this. I mean, you could even have a system where say, okay, if you are a descendant slave and you have a income below a certain amount, then you're potentially eligible. And that again, this you could make arguments against this as the email question did. Again, I'm not necessarily endorsing it. It does create some of its own problems, including line drawing, like what about white descendants of slaves who had one distant African-American ancestor. But I would say that it is arguably a non-racial category and thus subject to lower legal limitations. And also it is definitely would be preferable to what we have today and would be much more narrowly tailored to what the ultimate rationale for affirmative action is.
Excellent. Thank you. We don't have any other questions coming in right now, so I'm going to ask another one of my own. And that is, going back to these Supreme Court cases. Yeah, I agree with you that this court is likely to strike down racial preferences in a broad way. And my concern is that universities in response to that are going to get rid of objective measures of merit. They will stop asking students to take the LSAT, the MCAT, the SAT, the ACT, so that then we cannot use those data to prove that they have been discriminating on the basis of race. Because, of course, if you've followed the cases, you've known that one of the biggest pieces of evidence is the average SAT score needed by various racial groups to be admitted to Harvard or UNC. What do you think about that concern?
Yeah, Jenna, thank you so much for raising that, because I should have mentioned that as one of the ways that schools might react. And in fact, really outrageously, not only might schools react that way, University of California has already reacted that way. California banned affirmative action in state policy, including universities, back in 1996, and they tried to repeal that in the last election. They failed, and as soon as that failed, University of California announced that we're switching from being SAT optional to SAT not permitted. Mm-hmm. So they, for exactly the reason you suggested. This is very troubling. Jeff Rosen, writing in the New Republic years ago, he's now head of the National Constitution Center, said one reason he supports affirmative action is he feels like you could have a certain percentage of the class that's admitted with lower credentials, but if we don't have it, the impetus will be to get rid of all credentials, and then it'll really be a mess. So the question then would be, well, how do you admit students if you don't have any objective measure of their abilities? And that's a good question. I mean, in the old days, before the SAT, you would go by connections. Oh, this is Nelson Rockefeller's nephew, and I know the other guy from my golf club, and so forth. That wasn't fair. And today, it would really work to the benefit of not only of racial minorities if they could show they are such, they also work to the benefit of those who know how to put the right things on their resume. So my daughter just went through the college application process. We weren't some of these crazy parents who start like in 7th grade with admissions counselors, and I wasn't that concerned with her getting into the very top school she could possibly get into. But nevertheless, I'm a law professor. I've been to elite colleges myself. I know something about the process. I was able to guide her, like, well, this will look better, that will look worse. Here's how you write your essay. Here's what you should say in interviews. Here's what you should think about with your, when they ask you about your major. So that's a big advantage for someone like me. The one thing that can't be, let me put it slightly differently. Of all the things that are on your college application, everything can be gamed a lot, including GPA, because you take the right classes, including your activities, including your essay. You can even have other people write the essay for you, no one would know. The one thing that can't be gamed much is the SAT. Mm-hmm. Score, taking a course on it may improve your score 50 points or 75 points. It's not going to bring you from a 1200 to a 1500. Right. So the SAT is the one equalizer where if you're not from the background where you know how to apply, you can still get into a good college because they could see that you're talented. And it would be a real shame to lose that. And if you lose that and schools are still doing affirmative action anyway, we would wind up in a much worse place. I know that one solution would be, either by lawsuit or by statute, at least in red states, would just be to ban colleges from asking about race to begin with. If they're not allowed to use race after the Supreme Court opinion, why should you ask? What's the point of asking?
Yeah, absolutely. We have time for one more question. And so I'm going to give you a chance to wave your magic wand. If you could draft a bill in Congress and have it passed, by via fiat, to change our system of classifications, what would it say?
So I would say I would probably set up some sort of committee. I mean, this is a little bit of a cop out, but I would set up for anti-discrimination rules. I would set up some sort of committee saying, now it's 2023. Who are we worried about being discriminated against, and in what context, and what classifications would make sense? I think it would become out somewhat similar to what we have today. We probably add like, Muslims or something, but we can't classify by religion because of the Establishment Clause. But you probably have some groups that aren't included now. You probably de-emphasize some others. I would also say, well, I'd start with what I said before. First, we'd have to do a review of all racial classifications used by the government. Justify them with a compelling interest? Explain why we're doing it. So that'd be the first thing in the bill. If you can't justify it, and then if you can't justify by compelling interest, you have to stop using it. Then I would say, for these basic anti-discrimination enforcement, do what I just said. And for every other purpose, I'd say, once you show there's a justification for it, then you have to show how you're narrowly tailoring the classifications you're using for that justification. So for hate crimes laws, it makes sense to broadly look at also different groups that might be susceptible to hate crimes laws. If you're looking at, lots of other things, you might want to use, for example, for American Indian health issues, it turns out that you can't just combine all Native American groups. In fact, even in the same state, two different tribes that live 10 miles away may have very different outcomes. So that we want to discourage you from using broad census type categories, and to actually figure out what data you're trying to get for what purpose and use them narrowly that way.
All right. Thank you very much. With that, we're going to end our webinar. I want to remind everyone we are talking about Classified, the Untold Story of Racial Classification in America. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you so much, Jen. Great to do this.
Everybody have a wonderful afternoon. And if you want to know more, go to jamesgmartin.center. Have a good afternoon.